Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Lisa Peschel. I'm a senior lecturer in theater in the School of Arts and Creative Technologies here at the University of York. But my research is on the cultural life of a World War II Jewish ghetto called Theresienstadt. So I am very much looking forward to our presentation this evening, Lovers in Auschwitz, by Keren Blankfeld. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Keren Blankfeld. Keren is a long-form journalist with a special interest in investigative narrative nonfiction. A former staff writer for Forbes magazine, her stories have appeared in the New York Times, Forbes, Reuters, the Toronto Star, and others. She teaches reporting and writing at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and is also taught at New York University's Graduate School. She's been a guest on CNN, BBC World News, and E! Entertainment. She holds a BA in International Relations and English from Tufts University and an MS in Journalism from Columbia University, both in the US. Keren, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to meet you. And I also want to thank the York Festival of Ideas for having me. It's really nice to be here virtually. This is my first virtual event, and it's nice to know that there are people from all over the world joining us. I know actually it's special to me because I know there are people joining from Israel, from Brazil, and the book was recently published in Hungarian. It was in Holland. It's also in Italy and in Finland. So it's nice to be able to speak to a large group today. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how I got into this book, Lovers in Auschwitz, that was published in January. My inspiration was primarily my grandparents. My four grandparents are Holocaust survivors. They're all refugees. And ever since I was little, I remember hearing stories about them growing up in Europe and then their lives coming to a halt very suddenly. And then, the war beginning and everything turned upside down. So here is my grandmother. She was actually a child of Tehran. She was born in Poland, and she was sent to Tehran with a ship of orphans from Eastern Europe. And from Tehran, she went to the British Mandate of Palestine, and she was separated from her siblings. She grew up in a kibbutz and without her parents during the war. And this is my grandfather, Dov, and he also, he grew up in Dubno in Ukraine. He had a very normal childhood until the Nazis came to his town, and his mom actually shoved him and his father in a closet when the Nazis were coming because she thought they were coming after the boys and the men. She was wrong. And from inside the closet, he actually saw his younger sister being held by the hair and killed by the Nazis. His mother was killed soon after, and he ended up in the ghetto with his father. He managed to escape the ghetto, lived in the forest, became a partisan, ended up joining the Soviet army, and that's the picture you see here. Eventually, he survived the war, obviously, and eventually went to Brazil with my grandmother, who he met in Israel. And then these are my other grandparents who are also survivors. My grandfather was from Latvia, Eliezer. He was actually in the Soviet army during the war, and he fought the Nazis. And by the time he came home, he found that his entire family was gone. Everyone was killed, his parents, his sister, no one was left. Meanwhile, my grandmother, Helen, she was hidden with five other people, in the cellar of two Polish women. She survived 630 days and nights underground. And she would tell me that when she finally was liberated, she had to relearn how to walk because she'd been crouching underground for so long. And she had to learn to not be afraid of speaking out loud. She was used to speaking in whispers because she was afraid of being discovered. So they also they met in a displaced camp after the war, Feldafing. Sorry, no, they met at Schlachtensee. I'm confusing my my camps. They met in Schlachtensee, fell in love, got married in Germany, and ended up immigrating to Brazil as well, which is where I was born. So I had all these stories when I was growing up in my head, and I was always learning about how they survived. I was so interested in hearing about, losing everything and then having a new beginning, starting over from nothing. And I was working for a while as a journalist at Forbes, covering billionaires when we started hearing more and more in the news about the biggest refugee crisis since World War II. And I'd been at Forbes for a while, and I started thinking, I want to do something that's more, of interest to me and what I care about. So I started looking into the refugees who were coming into the US and just all over the world. I ended up traveling to Greece, and I went to Lesbos, where I volunteered for a while at Camp Moriah, which was a fascinating experience. I met people from Africa, from Afghanistan, and from Iraq, and a lot of them were kids, boys and teenagers who were basically starting life over. And I got to know some of them. I kept in touch with some of them. And one of them I know is a movie producer now in Germany. Another one I actually met with again when I went back to Greece another time, and he was working in Athens. So that was an incredible experience. After I volunteered there for a while, I decided I wanted to come back to the US and try to do some research on how refugees came into the United States around World War II. So I started kind of looking around in newspapers, and I found this story about a little girl who came into the US when she was 3 years old. So I found this in the archives of the New York Times, and I started looking, and she was the first person to get a visa into the United States after World War II. I was fascinated by this little girl. She was adopted by an American soldier, and her story, her photograph was plastered all over local New York papers back when she came in 1945. She was in the New York Times and the New York Post, everywhere. So I started getting curious. What happened to this little girl, Bella, who came to the US without a family and was adopted by a soldier? I started looking for her. This is the soldier who adopted her, Bert. And I was looking everywhere. I did all sorts of research, used every website database I could find, looking up her name, looking up his name. And eventually, it took over a year. I found her by kind of going into all sorts of rabbit holes. First, I discovered that the soldier actually got a divorce soon after he brought her into the United States. So I didn't know if her name was the same or what happened. As it turned out, she did change her name. And when I discovered her, she still had her cap. She had, kids and grandkids. She was living in New York City, just outside New York. And she was very happy, had a very happy life. And it was kind of incredible. When I met her, I was just blown away, especially seeing all these memories she had and all these these things she kept. She kept a treasure trove of documents. It was incredible. She was showing me scrapbooks that her adoptive parents kept, letters that the soldiers sent, documents. And she gave me this huge amount of information to look at. I brought it all home. I started looking through it. And as it turns out, her story was not at all what had been reported in 1945. She was not adopted by the soldier. It was basically a ruse, a public relations ruse, because nobody wanted immigrants in the US at the time. And people were afraid of foreigners, they were afraid of communists, and they just wanted to focus on America's children. So immigration was so incredibly difficult that they needed to create this PR spectacle to get public sympathy to bring this little girl in. So the soldier was actually adopting her for someone else. He did all the footwork to bring her into the US. They did this whole PR campaign. She came into the US. The photographers were all there waiting at the tarmac, from all the newspapers. They got her picture. And as soon as the photographers were gone, she was handed over to the family who actually adopted her. And she went on to live her life. So I discover this story and I'm just like, wow, it's incredible. It's not at all what I expected. And it became my first New York Times story, which you see here. After that, I was kind of hooked. I decided that I wanted to write a book about different kinds of stories about how people came into the United States. So I talked about it with everyone I could find. I would talk about it at parties. All my friends knew this, my parents' friends, everyone. So eventually I was at a party and someone told me, you should speak with David Wisnia. David has an incredible story. He came into the US and he was in Auschwitz and he was also an American soldier. And I'm thinking, okay, wow, this sounds really amazing. So she put me in touch with David's grandson, and his grandson arranged it so that I would go meet David at his home in Levittown, Pennsylvania. So this is David Wisnia, when he had his bar mitzvah. When I go to his house, he has this big American flag outside, this, white picket fence. It's just like the quintessential American dream house. And I meet him. He has no accent. He sounds completely American. His one accent is, the New York accent. It's pretty deeply ingrained there. And he's just this proud American guy. And so I was, curious to hear his story. He sits me down, has a great sense of humor, lots of patience. He's actually written a memoir about his story. It was published by a university press. And he starts telling me about how he grew up in a small town outside of Warsaw, eventually moved to Warsaw, and he always dreamed, his two biggest dreams were one of moving to the United States, and two of becoming this big opera star. So he thought that in the US, he'd be able to, make that dream come true. He also had two aunts living in New York, and he wanted to meet up with them and, have his life and his family's life there. He was part of a middle-class family that lived very well. He was a middle son, and his parents treated him kind of like a theater child. They took him to auditions at different places to sing. He ended up singing, what I'm showing you here is the Great Synagogue in Warsaw. He was one of their youngest singers, and he sang solos. He became this, pretty big singer in Warsaw within the community. And he was living a great life. They would go to the opera. He went to school. He was a pretty happy-go-lucky kid. That's how he always described himself. And then, of course, he had his bar mitzvah. And the day after his bar mitzvah, literally, Warsaw was invaded. So everything changes, right? He goes from being this happy-go-lucky kid to someone who's living with his family in the Warsaw Ghetto. They share a room with a couple of other families. He's sleeping on the floor. Uh, Food is very scarce, and suddenly, life is completely upside down. He's not going to school anymore. Definitely no more singing, and his father has a job where he goes to work at the airport, which is where the Nazis were staying. He would clean up and tidy up their the Nazi army's cots and things like that. One day, his dad tells David, "I need you to go for me to the airport because I'm not feeling well." So David took his place, went to the airport, and he came home to Warsaw, to the ghetto, after a day of work, and found his entire family in a pile of corpses, dead. And this was his parents, his grandparents, and his brothers. He was 15 years old, completely alone in the world. This was the one part of David's story that when he told me, he just couldn't tell it. He basically had to stop. It was very emotional for him, and I can obviously understand why. From that moment on, he was on his own. So he ran out of the Warsaw Ghetto, somehow managed to escape through the barbed wire, this little opening he found. And from there, he went from ghetto to ghetto, basically surviving until finally he was transported to Auschwitz, the most notorious Nazi killing camp. Landing in Auschwitz alone, his first job, all the prisoners are, shaved completely. They are everything they own is taken away from them, and they're tattooed on their left forearm. So basically, they go from being human beings to suddenly becoming a number. And they stick around as long as they're of use to the Nazis. So, meaning they need to work. David's job was carrying corpses of the dead and placing them into trucks. So he told me about this job, and basically he said that he got to the point where he was desensitized. He'd been doing it for so long that he just, the bodies became things, and he was so hungry because the rations that they gave prisoners were minimal. They were not rations that people could survive on for a long time. The usual time that people lasted in Auschwitz were a few weeks or a few months, especially if they were working outside like David. He was working in the cold. All he had was, his uniform. There were no protections. He had, barely any water. So he told me, I was living day by day, minute by minute. It was just, surviving the next second. And he kept thinking, reciting to himself the address of his aunts in New York, and thinking, one day, I need to just, keep looking into the future. One day I'll be there. So David survives. He ended up surviving Auschwitz for 3 years, partially thanks to his voice. The Nazis discovered that he was a singer and he could entertain them. So once they found that out, they said, okay, you're singing to us. You no longer have to work outside. You're now our entertainer, plus you're gonna get extra rations of food. So David now has extra food. He's working inside. He has a much better job, and he survives. He lives And he survives up until the death march when everyone's leaving Auschwitz in 1945. The Nazis want people to leave because they need to hide their crimes. And David goes on a death march to another camp, Dachau, and eventually he manages to run away from the death march, and he's basically sleeping in barns during the day. And by night, he's kind of moving around, trying to figure out, where to go, trying to go to the front. And then one day, he tells me, he hears these sounds of tanks, and he goes running to look what's going on. He glances down this hill and he sees a whole stream of American tanks. And he goes running down like, oh my God, finally I'm going to be saved. And of course, there's like the conversation. He didn't know English, he knew a little bit of English, but David was gifted with an incredible ear. And I think that's part of his singing talent. Eventually, he's able to communicate. They know right away that he's not a Nazi. He's, someone who survived. And they say, you're joining us. We're adopting you. Here's an American uniform. Here's a gun. They teach him how to shoot a gun. And now he's part of the American Army. So David lands in the US as an American soldier. He's literally dressed in American uniform. He tells me this story, and I'm just like, wow, this is incredible, right? I've never heard anything like this. So I stand up to leave, I thank him, and I'm about to leave when he says, kind of nonchalantly, by the way, I had this girlfriend while I was in Auschwitz. Her name was Tippi. And I sit back down, I look at him, and I'm like, did you say girlfriend? He says, yes, I had a girlfriend in Auschwitz. We would meet up while we were there. And we actually met up a couple of years ago for the first time in 72 years. We had a reunion in Manhattan where she lived. And at this point, I'm thinking to myself, David is in his 90s. He's lived through a lot. Maybe he's confusing things. I'm not sure, but but I ask him, okay, tell me more about Zippi. And my recorder is still running. As a journalist, I've learned never to turn off my recorder until I'm long gone from the scene of the interview. So I'm sitting there with my recorder playing out my recorder going, and I'm like, tell me about Zippi. And he tells me that Zippi was a special prisoner in Auschwitz, and that she met up with him, and that they became boyfriend girlfriend. She was a graphic designer, and again, he tells me graphic designer in Auschwitz, and that was her job in Auschwitz. And I'm thinking, Auschwitz is a killing camp, not a clothing factory, or, there's what's the graphic design needs for Auschwitz. So I'm thinking this is sounds like an iffy story. But then he says there's an academic book that's been published about her. 5 different historians interviewed her, and they wrote about her from different perspectives. So I say, okay, I leave. And of course, first thing I do that night is I look up Tippi Tischauer. And as it turns out, she's real. There is a book about Zippi. And as it turns out, she's pretty incredible. So I started reading about Zippi, and I was hooked. First of all, she was 7 years older than David. She was from Slovakia, and she had this personality. She grew up with her grandparents. Her mom died when she was 5 years old, and her family kind of got broken up. So she went to live with her maternal grandparents. And she had this, she was just this force. She was walking, for instance, down the street one day, and she saw a woman painting a shop, doing a sign for a shop. And she says, huh, that's what I want to do. That's the career I want. So she walks into the shop and she asks for the owner, and she tells the owner, I want that job. And the owner looks at her and he says, women don't do that job. That's graphic design. That's not for you. And she says, I literally just saw a woman doing the job. And he says, that's my wife. She's just helping me out. Women don't do this job. And she says, well, I am doing this job. I want to do this job. So just, hire me. And he says, well, you have to go to trade school. You have to get certified. So once you do that, if you're able to do that, because no woman has done that in this town, then you can come back to me and I'll give you a job. So of course, what does Tippi do? She goes and gets certified. She gets everything she needs, goes back to the guy and says, okay, here you go. Give me the job. And he gives it to her. And she becomes the first woman and the first Jew to be working in a company for graphic design. And that's just the kind of personality that Tippi had. This is Tippi painting a sign at one of the ateliers in Bratislava, Slovakia, where she was from. And this picture was actually in a local newspaper. So that's Tippi, right? And she's engaged to this man. She's doing what she loves, and she's happy. But the war starts, right? Everything turns upside down. She has to hustle for work because suddenly Jews can't find jobs. But she says that for a graphic designer, apparently there was a need, so she was able to find lots of work until eventually notices start appearing around town that if you're an unmarried woman under the age of 25, you have to report to a certain place. So she was unmarried and she was under 25, so she reported. And at first they thought that they were just going to go volunteer somewhere, work at a field. They weren't really sure what these women were going to do. However, they were transported to Auschwitz, right? She was in the second transport to Auschwitz with 998 other women. She arrives there and is immediately shaved, entire body shaved. Everything she had is taken from her. And these people had packed, their best clothing because they thought, who knows what's going to be there when I get back? I'm going to take my good stuff. So they get there and everything's confiscated, right? They don't get to keep anything, including whatever they're wearing, including photographs that they might have packed, everything. So she gets there, she's shaved. Eventually she's tattooed. She becomes a number, just like David. They're both numbers. They're no longer human beings in the eyes of the Nazis, in the eyes of the camp. Her first job there was carrying stones to actually build some of the barracks that people were going to move into, because Auschwitz was still under construction. This is what it would become, Auschwitz-Birkenau, actually two different camps that were two different towns. It was not just, like a small summer camp. This was two towns, and the prisoners were separated into different groups. Women were kept separate from men. The Roma were kept together. The political prisoners, usually they they separated people by where they came from. And people tended to stay with their own. So Tippi was, from Slovakia. She tended to stay with people from Slovakia at first, but that just wasn't her personality. She was a curious person. She liked to meet people. And so she branched out. She made friends with everyone, with political prisoners, with people who were imprisoned for being homosexuals, with the Roma. She just befriended everyone, and this actually helped save her life in multiple occasions because she got sick often, as did so many of the people there, and also because on a day-to-day basis, people were just being shot at random. Auschwitz was about luck, and then there were certain things that kept you alive, including being useful to the Nazis. But this, for instance, is the Black Wall, where the Nazis like to put entire families naked, standing in front of the wall, and then shoot them at point blank. Usually they like to shoot the kids before they shot the parents so that the parents could see their kids being killed. So this is the kind of place Auschwitz is. And as I mentioned, all their clothing was confiscated by the Nazis. And these are the prisoners whose job was to package things up, and they were supposed to sort everything and create these little bricks of clothing that were tightly bound together, and they would put it in warehouses that they called Canada. They called these places Canada because they thought Canada's a rich country, and that's where all their riches were kept. So everything went to Canada. And Canada is where Zippi and David started meeting. It took a while to get there. Zippi first saw David in what they called the sauna, which is where they disinfected prisoners' clothing. It was not a sauna, it was just where they, cleaned and disinfected everything. She saw him there, and they started exchanging notes at first, which was, by the way, an extremely dangerous thing to do, because if you were caught writing in Auschwitz, you could get in trouble. And eventually, she sent a message to him to meet her in Canada. And what she had done was she created this hollow spot in the middle of all these packs of clothing where only two bodies would fit. So once you approached the spot and you knew where you were going, you removed a couple of these bricks of clothing, you went inside, put the bricks of clothing back in. And so from the outside, it looks like just, piles of clothing, but there's actually room for these two bodies. And David and Tippi managed to meet there. And once they climbed into this little hollow, they became people again, right? Suddenly they're able to touch each other, to have a conversation, not a great conversation. He was Polish, she was Slovakian, and somehow they made it work. She taught him a Hungarian song. They spoke in whispers, and they had a love affair. So inside this hollow, life became, human again. And then when they left the hollow, they were numbers again, each one doing their job, and just kind of surviving day to day. So it was a huge risk they were taking, but they wanted. I asked David about this, and he said it was worth it. I didn't know how much longer I would survive, and it was just, I looked forward to this, right? It was their time together to be people. So the war is coming to an end, and they've survived 3 years in Auschwitz, which is very, it's not usual, put it that way. Like I said, people usually have like the bare minimum of rations. They are having to deal with the elements outside, and they don't survive more than a few weeks or months at the most. But David had this special job, and Zippi, I'm not going to get into all of it, but she had managed to rise the ranks of the prisoner hierarchy that they had in Auschwitz. She had made herself useful to the Nazis in the sense that she was the graphic designer, which meant when the Nazis ran out of Russian uniforms to give the prisoners who were arriving into the camp, it was just, so many people were coming every day. They ran out, so they started giving them civilian clothes. And Zippi's job was to draw a thick red stripe on the back of the prisoners' clothing so that they could be seen from afar and identified as prisoners, so that nobody would confuse them with a civilian. That was one of her jobs. She was also eventually helping organize data that that was sent back to Berlin about who was coming in, who was going out. She was in charge of what they called a numbers book, where she actually had to write down the number of the prisoner who would be getting killed the next day by the gas chamber. So she knew who would be killed before they were actually being killed. And she describes this as just unbearable, walking around the camp and seeing someone with, a target on their back. She knew they were going to be gone the next day. She did use her position to save many lives by replacing some of these numbers with numbers of people who were already dead. So obviously she couldn't do that for everyone, but she was able to do that for some people. And instead of sending, 500 people to a gas chamber the next day, 400 would show up and 100 would be saved because these were, they were dead numbers that she had inserted in place of the 100 who were supposed to go. She was able to do this and not get caught a number of times. So David and Tippi, toward the end of the war, agreed to meet again in Warsaw if they both survived once the war was over. And as I mentioned, David went on to become a soldier, right? He escaped to the death march, he ran into the Americans, and here we are, he's an American soldier now. He arrives in the US and they were not able to meet. Their lives each took different turns. Tippi ended up in the camp Feldafing, where she met her future husband, Erwin. And they went on to travel throughout South America. They lived in Australia for a while. She found that her brother was alive and they actually lived in Australia too. So they were able to have a relationship. And so they, they each lived their lives. And eventually, as David told me, they were able to reconnect in Manhattan, of all places. And this was 72 years after they split apart in Auschwitz. So David had actually tried getting together with Tippi a couple of times, and she didn't want to see him. He had not shown up in Warsaw, but she had, and she was not pleased, obviously. She had been heartbroken. So when he tried to get together with her years later, she didn't want to do it. But he'd always had this lingering question in his head, people survived Auschwitz for 3 months, and here he was, someone who survived for 3 years. Yes, he had a better job. Yes, he entertained the Nazis, but he'd also gotten in trouble a couple of times. He wasn't a saint. He took a few risks while he was in Auschwitz. And still he survived. So he always wondered how. And he wanted to ask Zippi because he imagined she had something to do with this. So when they reunited, David took his kids. Eventually, obviously, she agreed to meeting up with him after her husband died. He brought his two kids to her apartment, and Tippi at this point was well in her 90s. She was partially deaf. She could barely see, and she was lying down in a hospital bed in the middle of her living room. So when they first walk in, David's grandson said that she didn't seem to recognize him, and her grandson was feeling like, he was worried about his grandfather. What if she doesn't recognize him? What if this is, doesn't go well? But David walked up to Tippi. He held her hand, and he leaned in and said, "Tippi, it's me, David." And his grandson told me her eyes lit up. You could see the life coming back to her eyes, and she immediately said, "David." And they went into a conversation in English, and they caught up as though, they had just gotten apart for a few years. And it was a touching reunion, and David got to ask her the question, did you have something to do with me surviving Auschwitz? And she said, yeah, I did. She saved him on five different occasions. I don't have time to get into it right now. It's a fascinating story, but I detail it more in the book. I know I only have a couple of minutes, but they never saw each other again. Zippi passed away in 2019. She was 99 years old. David passed away in 2021. He was 94 years old. And I wrote a story about them for the New York Times. It went viral. Not anything I would have ever imagined for an Auschwitz story in the New York Times, but I think it hit a nerve because it was so much, it's a story about love and hope and in a place that you would never imagine. And it's about people seeing humanity, finding humanity, in the depths of hell. So I wrote this article, and so much of what I had learned ended up in the cutting room floor. Like I just couldn't fit the story in there. She had been part of the resistance. She had done a lot of resistance work in Auschwitz. And then there are stories about David, his near escapes, and then after the war, which is what I initially wanted to talk to him about their new beginnings. And there was so much material that I wasn't able to get into. So I wrote a book that came out in January, and it's been really well received. I've been really in awe. It was in People magazine, it was in The Guardian, The Telegraph, and Time. And I think, for me, writing this book was a testament to the human ability to thrive even under the worst circumstance possible, to find, a glimmer of light and make life worth living, even if just for a moment. So it was a lesson for me, and a life lesson. Anyway, that's the the gist of David and Zippi's story and how I came to it. And I'm happy to I'd be remiss not to mention this. These are my two grandmothers, Helen and Zipporah, and me in the middle. So as I was doing my research for this article, for this book, article first, I learned that Zippi's full name was Helen Zipporah, first and middle names. And this is my grandmother, Helen, and this is my grandmother, Zipporah. So once I learned this, I was just even more enamored. I just felt like, there's, I had to tell this story about this incredible woman. So anyway, I'm open to any questions you might have. Feel free to shout or put them in the chat.
Karen, thank you so much for sharing that incredible story. And thank you for sharing that photo of your grandmother's at the end. And I've had the great good fortune to read your book. So this ongoing notion of, there are certain coincidences that seem to bring us to these stories somehow is so remarkable. And I have to say, I was really touched by what you wrote in your book and what you shared today, that it was only at the very end of your interview with David that he mentioned, oh, and by the way, I had a
Right.
girlfriend in Auschwitz. And because you have this habit of you don't turn the tape recorder off, you were able to write this story not only about his remarkable life, but about hers as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like the best stories are often ones that you're not expecting, that you just kind of stumble upon.
And these are, yeah, two absolutely stunning stories. We do have a question in the chat, and by the way, everybody listening, if you do have questions, please do put them in the Q&A section. Laura asks, did David have regrets that he did not go to Warsaw?
He didn't. Not at all. And I'll tell you, I've had some reactions about him not going to Warsaw. Um, he was 13 when the war started,
Mhm.
and he was 15 by the time he was on his own without family. So he had his childhood, in essence, cut from his life. It just cut short. So, people, I think, Tippi was upset that he didn't come to Warsaw, and they did have this romance and this promise that they made to each other, but I can't really blame him. He was a kid. He was also 7 years younger than her. And he felt like he'd run into the Americans, and this was, a lifelong dream for him. And what he ended up with the white picket fence, and it was, what he'd always dreamed of. Meanwhile, Tsippi was quite a bit older than him. She had lived her youth. In fact, she had a fiance while she was in Bratislava, and he didn't survive the war. She learned of his death while she was in Auschwitz. So she was, I think they were in different points of life. But no, to answer your question, I did ask him the same thing, and he didn't have regrets.
In your book, when you narrate this meeting that David had with these American soldiers, it sounds so glamorous. And considering his upbringing and the fact that he knew his beloved aunts were in the United States, I mean, to run into this group of soldiers must have been just tremendously thrilling.
Yeah, I think it was thrilling and nerve-wracking, and especially at first having this miscommunication, not being able to talk.
Mhm.
Um, he asked if anyone spoke Polish, and he said that this guy came. They found someone who spoke Polish, and his Polish was even worse than than David's English. And then he asked if there were any Jews, and then this guy came who spoke some Yiddish, but his Yiddish was even worse than the other guy's Polish. So I think it was, I mean, by the time David was telling me the story, he just made it into this like comedy of errors, but I'm sure it was, it must have been thrilling and nerve-wracking.
Yeah, thrilling and terrifying at the time. But you write really movingly in your book about Zippy's husband, the man that she did marry, and it sounds like they had a wonderful life together. So even though she clearly was disappointed that David had not come, she did have a very full and wonderful relationship.
She did. She had this incredible partnership with her husband, Erwin. She met him, as I said, at the DP camp. And they, she as you might remember, I said that she was this curious person who wanted to know everyone. She wanted to learn everything. She loved music. She loved cultures. She loved languages. She spoke multiple languages. And they ended up traveling and living in South America. And she was able to help people in these places. And then eventually he became a professor at NYU, who has became a very prominent professor at NYU. He wrote the research about ergonomics, best practices for workers not to get injured. And he was featured in Time magazine. He got a lot of coverage, and she actually helped him with his research. She did all the diagrams for everything he ever wrote. She was really a partner in his work.
I remember in your book, I think one of the accolades he received is, Erwin he's doing the work of 3, maybe 4 people. And I thought, well, he's definitely doing the work of 2, that Zippi played such a role in his own career.
She did. She was pivotal in his career.
We do have another question in the chat. We have compliments in the chat. We have a question in the chat. Did David tell you what happened to Canada after the Nazis fell? So what happened with all that loot that the Nazis had gathered?
Well, a lot of it had been sent back to Berlin and distributed among, the Nazis and sold. And when they were leaving Auschwitz, the Nazis burned down everything that might have been evidence for their crimes. So they spent, a few days burning down disassembling crematoriums, gas chambers, burning down the warehouses, burning down whatever was in the warehouses. So much of it ended up being lost.
All these precious personal things that people brought with them.
Right.
I do have a question about Zippi and her work as a graphic designer, because you write about, because of that talent, she ended up creating a lot of documents for the Nazis while she was in Auschwitz, but she also made copies and stashed them away, hoping that someday after the war, she would be able to share this information. Did any of those ever turn up?
That's a great question. So, yeah, that was one of the ways that she tried to resist. She copied everything. And yeah, she would stash it in closets and wherever she could. And this was one of her questions in the end. What happened to this stuff? She doesn't know of any of it being kept. And she actually created this 3-dimensional model of Auschwitz that showed the women's camp exactly as it was, and it disappeared. It's been a mystery to historians I've spoken with. Everyone's been looking for it. Everyone tried to track it down, and one thing that people think is that maybe it's in Soviet archives that we just don't have access to.
Maybe someday this will all come to light again. We do have just a few more minutes. There is a question. Yeah, you write about this in more detail in the book, but Catherine Arnott asks, how did David and Zippi know how to get in contact with each other after the war? And then how did they find each other again?
So Tippi had a book published it was edited by a director at the US Holocaust Museum in DC. So David's family contacted the museum, and then the historian who edited her book, Jürgen Mathhaus, who also became a good friend of hers and a huge source for my book too. He got in touch with her and asked if it was okay to put them in touch, and they did. He ended up doing that.
So they were able to have this final meeting near the end of both of their lives.
Right.
We are almost out of time. So those of you who sent questions, thank you very much. I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all of them. But Keren, thank you so much for joining us today. And I was really glad to see the slides of all the places that have taken your book to heart. And I do encourage all of our listeners today, you've heard a tiny bit of the story today, but there's so much more to read. So please do,
Thank
please
you
do
so
get the book.
much.
I'll
Thank
just
you so
say
much for having me.
yeah, I'll just say a few more words, just a few reminders to those of you listening. I see that the York Ideas chat has put up a message. Just a reminder, the recording of this event will be available on the festival's York Ideas YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival. You will be contacted by email when this video is available to view. And if you do want to purchase a copy of Keren's book, Lovers in Auschwitz, which I very heartily recommend that you do, it will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. And you can see the link there in the chat, foxlanebooks.co.uk. Once more, Keren, thank you very much for joining us.